Well now, where do I even begin with this story? It's just goodness. It's something else, isn't it? I tell you what, I was sitting here listening, and I could hardly believe my ears. The nerve of that boy, Derek, talking to his own mama that way. I want you all to know, I was ready to reach through this screen and give him a good talking to myself. But Margaret, bless her heart, she handled it all with more grace than I think I could have mustered. And you know what? That's exactly what makes this story so special. Because Margaret isn't just any woman. She's every woman who's ever been told to sit down, be quiet, and let the men handle things. She's every woman who's ever swallowed her words, bitten her tongue, and smiled when she wanted to scream. You know, I never would have guessed that sweet woman had that kind of steel in her backbone. All those years, playing the part of the perfect little housewife, when really, her Thomas had been keeping all sorts of secrets. And then for that son of hers to try and take advantage of her like that. I tell you what, some people just don't know when to quit while they're ahead. Now, before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to set the scene for you, because to truly understand what Margaret went through, you need to understand where she came from. This wasn't just about money, or a will, or even family betrayal. This was about a woman finding her voice after decades of silence. This was about breaking free from chains she didn't even know she was wearing. Let me tell you a little bit about the world Margaret grew up in. She was raised in a time when women were expected to be seen and not heard. Her mother had taught her that a good wife supports her husband, no matter what. That a good mother sacrifices everything for her children. And that a good woman? Well, a good woman never, ever rocks the boat. A good woman keeps the peace, even if it means losing pieces of herself along the way. Margaret's mother, God rest her soul, had lived by those rules her entire life. She'd married young, raised 5 children, and never once complained, at least not out loud. But Margaret remembered catching her mother sometimes, late at night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, staring at nothing. She never asked what her mother was thinking about. Maybe she was afraid to know. Now, before I go any further, I'd love for you all to drop a little comment and let me know where you're tuning in from today. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it really does help us keep bringing you stories like this one. I appreciate each and every one of you taking the time. Your support means the world to me. It really does. So, Margaret met Thomas when she was just 22 years old, fresh out of secretarial school, working at a law firm downtown, still believing that life was full of possibilities. He walked into that office one Tuesday afternoon, and Margaret said later that it felt like the whole room shifted. He was charming, successful, and had that kind of confidence that made everyone in the room pay attention. The kind of man who knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. She thought she'd hit the jackpot. Here was a man who could provide for her, who seemed to adore her, and who promised her a life of comfort and security. He brought her flowers every Friday. He opened doors for her, pulled out her chair at restaurants, told her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And Margaret, young and hopeful, and wanting so badly to believe in fairy tales, fell head over heels. But here's the thing about promises, friends. They're only as good as the person making them. And Thomas? Well, Thomas had a lot of promises he never intended to keep. He was the kind of man who said all the right things but did whatever he pleased. The kind of man who confused control with love and possession, with devotion. They got married 6 months after they met. Margaret's mother had concerns. She thought it was too fast, thought Margaret barely knew this man. But she kept quiet. That's what women did back then. They kept quiet and hoped for the best. The first few years of their marriage were what you might call the honeymoon phase. Thomas was attentive, generous with his compliments, and seemed genuinely proud to have Margaret by his side. They bought a beautiful home in the suburbs, the kind with a white picket fence and a garden that Margaret tended to with her own hands. She planted roses along the walkway, tulips by the mailbox, and a little herb garden outside the kitchen window. For a while, she was happy. Or at least, she told herself she was happy. She had everything she was supposed to want: a handsome husband, a beautiful home, the promise of children to come. What more could a woman ask for? But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Thomas started working later and later. He'd come home smelling of perfume that wasn't Margaret's. He'd have phone calls he'd take in the other room, speaking in hushed tones that would stop the moment Margaret walked in. When she asked about it, he'd wave his hand dismissively. "Business," he'd say. "Nothing you need to worry your pretty head about." That phrase, "your pretty head," started to grate on Margaret, but she pushed the feeling down, the way she'd learned to push so many feelings down. She told herself she was being paranoid, insecure, ungrateful. She had a good life. She should be thankful. Now, Margaret wasn't stupid. She knew something wasn't right. But what could she do? She had 2 children by then, Derek and his younger sister, Amanda. She had no job, no savings of her own, and no skills that would help her survive in the working world. Thomas had made sure of that. When she'd mentioned going back to work after the kids started school, he'd laughed. Actually laughed. "Why would you want to work?" he'd said, "when I provide everything you need?" And just like that, another door closed. Another possibility disappeared. Margaret learned to stop suggesting things, stop dreaming about alternatives. It was easier that way. You see, that's one of the things that really gets me about situations like this. It wasn't just that Thomas was unfaithful, although Lord knows that was bad enough. It was that he had systematically isolated Margaret from any possibility of independence. He controlled the money, he made all the decisions, and he made sure she knew that without him, she was nothing. He never hit her, never raised his voice in anger. He didn't need to. He had other ways of keeping her small. The credit cards were in his name. The bank accounts were in his name. The house, the cars, everything, all in his name. Margaret had to ask for money to buy groceries, had to explain every purchase, had to justify every penny she spent. And Thomas would review it all, questioning why she needed this or that, making her feel foolish for wanting anything at all. Margaret once told me, and I'm not breaking any confidences here because she's spoken about this publicly, she once told me that there were nights she'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had gotten so small. She'd had dreams once. She'd wanted to be a teacher. Can you believe that? She loved children, loved the idea of shaping young minds, of making a difference in the world. When she was young, she used to volunteer at the local library, reading stories to kids during summer programs. She had a gift for it, the way she could bring characters to life, the way children would gather around her, completely captivated. She thought maybe, someday, she'd have her own classroom, her own students, her own purpose beyond being someone's wife and someone's mother. But Thomas had laughed at that idea. Why, you want to work, he'd said, when I can provide everything you need. And somehow, that phrase, everything you need, had become a cage, because what Margaret needed wasn't things. What she needed was respect. What she needed was to be seen as a person, not just as Thomas's wife. What she needed was to matter. Now let's talk about the children for a moment, because this is where the story really starts to break your heart. Derek and Amanda were born just 2 years apart, but they couldn't have been more different. It was like they came from 2 entirely different families, even though they grew up under the same roof. Amanda took after her mother. She was kind, thoughtful, and always seemed to understand things that were never spoken aloud. Even as a little girl, she'd climb into Margaret's lap when she sensed her mother was sad. Just sit there quietly, offering comfort without words. She had this way of looking at you, even as a child, that made you feel like she could see right into your soul. Amanda was the kind of kid who brought home stray animals, who stood up for the bullied kids at school, who cried during sad movies and laughed with her whole body during happy ones. She felt everything deeply, and she wasn't afraid to show it. Margaret used to worry that the world would be too harsh for someone so sensitive, but as it turned out, Amanda's sensitivity was her greatest strength. But Derek was his father's son through and through. From the time he could walk, he followed Thomas around like a shadow, mimicking his mannerisms, his way of speaking, even the way he'd dismiss Margaret with a wave of his hand. He learned early that his father's attention was earned through dominance, through being tough, through treating weakness with contempt. Thomas encouraged this, of course. He was proud to have a son who was a chip off the old block. He'd take Derek golfing, to business dinners, to the kinds of places where men made deals and shook hands, and pretended that women didn't exist except to serve drinks and look pretty. Margaret tried to reach Derek. She really did. She tried to teach him kindness, empathy, the importance of treating people with respect. She'd sit with him at night, reading stories about heroes who were brave and good, hoping some of it would sink in. But every lesson she tried to impart was undermined by Thomas. "Don't coddle the boy," he'd say. "He needs to learn to be tough. This world isn't for the weak." And so Derek grew up believing that strength meant control, that success meant domination, and that women were there to serve. It breaks my heart to say it, but that's the truth of it. By the time Derek was a teenager, he barely acknowledged his mother except to make demands. He'd leave his dishes on the table, his clothes on the floor, expecting her to clean up after him like she was the hired help. The worst part, Thomas praised him for it. "That's my boy," he'd say, beaming, with pride. "Knows how to take charge." Amanda, on the other hand, became Margaret's confidant. They'd have long talks in the kitchen while cooking dinner, sharing secrets and dreams. Amanda would help with the dishes, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to be close to her mother. They'd whisper and laugh and sometimes cry together, creating a little world that Thomas and Derek couldn't touch. Amanda was the one who encouraged Margaret to start keeping a journal, to write down her thoughts and feelings. "Someday, Mama," she'd say, "you're going to need to remember who you really are. You're going to need to remember that you're more than just Dad's wife." Wise words from such a young girl, don't you think? It's almost like she knew what was coming. Children often see more than we give them credit for. Now here's where things start to get really interesting. It was the spring of 2019 when Thomas had his heart attack. He was 63 years old, overweight, and had never listened to a doctor in his life. He thought he was invincible, the way men like him often do. He ate what he wanted, drank what he wanted, and considered exercise a waste of time better spent making money. Margaret found him collapsed in his home office, clutching his chest. That office had always been off-limits to her, his private sanctuary where he conducted his mysterious business. But that day, she heard a thump and a groan, and when she rushed in, she found him on the floor, face grey, gasping for air. She called 911, of course, and rode with him in the ambulance. Despite everything, all the years of neglect, the affairs, the condescension, she held his hand and told him it would be all right, because that's who Margaret was. That's the kind of person 40 years of putting others first had made her. Even in that moment, her instinct was to comfort him, to be the good wife. Thomas survived, but just barely. The doctors said he'd need months of recovery, and that he'd have to make major lifestyle changes. No more red meat, no more cigars, no more 18-hour workdays. Of course, Thomas being Thomas, he ignored most of their advice. He was back to his old habits within weeks, convinced that the rules didn't apply to him. But that's not the important part of this story. The important part is what Margaret found while Thomas was in the hospital. You see, she had to go into his office to find his insurance papers. That office had always been off-limits to her, Thomas's private domain where he conducted his business. But now, with him unconscious in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines and monitors, Margaret had no choice but to enter that forbidden space. She remembers the feeling of crossing that threshold. After all those years, it felt almost like trespassing. Her heart was pounding, even though she had every right to be there. That's what decades of being made to feel small will do to you. Make you feel like a stranger in your own home. What she found in those filing cabinets changed everything. Bank accounts she never knew existed. Not one or two, but dozens, scattered across different banks, some of them offshore. Investment portfolios worth millions, properties in other states, a cabin in Colorado, a condo in Florida, an apartment in New York City, a whole empire she'd never known about. And letters, oh, the letters, from other women, some of them going back decades. Love letters, Margaret realized with a sick feeling in her stomach. Thomas had been carrying on affairs their entire marriage, and some of these women had been in his life longer than she had. There were lawyers' letters too, and correspondence with business partners about deals that seemed, even to Margaret's untrained eye, questionable at best. A whole secret life that Thomas had been living right under her nose. All those late nights, all those business trips, all those phone calls taken in the other room. She finally understood what they'd really been about, and the humiliation of it, the sheer scale of the deception, took her breath away. But here's the thing that really got to Margaret. Here's what made her sit down on that cold office floor and cry for the first time in years. It wasn't the money, and it wasn't even the other women. She'd suspected those things, deep down, even if she'd never let herself fully acknowledge them. No, what broke her was the will. Thomas had written a will, you see, a secret will that left everything, every penny, every property, every investment, to Derek. Margaret was to receive nothing except the house she already lived in, and even that was contingent on her good behavior. His words, not mine. There were conditions, pages of conditions, about how she was expected to live, what she was allowed to do, who she was allowed to see. Can you imagine? After 40 years of marriage, after raising his children, after sacrificing her dreams and her independence, and her very identity, she was being treated like a servant who might be dismissed at any moment, like she was nothing more than an employee who hadn't quite earned her pension. Margaret sat on that floor for a long time. She cried until she had no tears left, and then something shifted inside her. Something that had been dormant for 40 years woke up and stretched its legs. She dried her eyes, stood up, and looked around that office with new eyes. Not the eyes of a victim, but the eyes of a survivor. Now, a lot of women in Margaret's position might have confronted Thomas right then and there, might have made a scene, demanded answers, threatened divorce, might have let the anger consume them, burned the whole thing down in a blaze of righteous fury. But Margaret was smarter than that. She'd spent 40 years learning to observe, to wait, to plan. She'd learned to be invisible, to be underestimated, to see everything while appearing to see nothing. And now, for the first time, she was going to use those skills for herself. She made copies of everything, every document, every letter, every bank statement. She photographed pages and pages of records, working methodically through the night while Thomas lay unconscious in his hospital bed. She put them in a safety deposit box that she opened in her own name, the first thing she'd ever done in her own name in 40 years. And then she put everything back exactly where she'd found it, careful not to leave a single trace. Thomas came home from the hospital, and Margaret took care of him just like she always had. She cooked his meals, his favorite dishes, the ones she'd perfected over decades. She managed his medications, helped him with his exercises, and smiled at him across the dinner table. To anyone watching, she was the devoted wife, the perfect caretaker, the woman who had forgiven all his sins. But now, there was something different in her eyes, a spark that Thomas was too arrogant to notice, a calculation behind every smile, a purpose behind every kindness. Margaret was playing a role, just as she'd always played a role. But now, she was the one writing the script. She reached out to Amanda first, of course. Her daughter had become a successful lawyer in the city, corporate law, specializing in complex financial cases. Margaret had never been prouder than the day Amanda passed the bar. Here was her daughter, the little girl who used to climb into her lap, now a force to be reckoned with in her own right. Amanda was shocked by what her mother had discovered, but not entirely surprised. "I always knew there was something wrong with Dad," she said. "I just didn't know how deep it went." I'm so sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. But then her shock turned to determination. We're going to fix this, Amanda said. We're going to make sure you get everything you deserve. Together, mother and daughter began building a case. They hired a forensic accountant to trace Thomas's hidden assets, a meticulous woman named Patricia, who treated the investigation like a personal crusade. They documented everything, every lie, every deception, every penny that had been hidden away. They built a timeline of Thomas's affairs, his secret accounts, his questionable business dealings, and they waited, because timing, as Margaret had learned, was everything. Thomas passed away 18 months later. Another heart attack, this time final. He'd been sitting in his office, that same office where Margaret had discovered his secrets, when his heart gave out for the last time. Margaret found him slumped over his desk, papers scattered around him, a half-finished glass of whiskey at his elbow. And I know this might sound harsh, but I think Margaret felt more relief than grief. She'd already mourned the man she thought she'd married. She'd mourned him years ago, every time she found lipstick on his collar, every time he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, every time he made her feel like she was less than nothing. The man who died was a stranger. The man who died was someone she'd never really known at all. The funeral was a circus, of course. All of Thomas's business associates showed up, men in expensive suits who shook Margaret's hand and told her what a great man her husband had been. Women she'd never met sent flowers and condolences, and Margaret wondered how many of them had been in those letters she'd found. Derek flew in with his family, playing the grieving son, already talking about Dad's legacy and what he planned to do with the family business. He walked around like he owned the place, which, he believed, he soon would. He barely acknowledged Margaret, except to tell her she should take it easy and let the men handle the arrangements. He actually patted her on the head at one point, like she was a child, like she was a pet. Margaret smiled and nodded and let him think he was in charge. Let him think he had already won. The reading of the will was scheduled for a week after the funeral. Derek arrived early, dressed in his best suit, practically bouncing with anticipation. He'd brought his wife and children, already planning how he'd divide up the spoils. Amanda was there too, quiet and watchful, standing beside her mother. When she opened up that folder and saw the look on his face, I bet that was worth the wait. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving person. You see, what Derek didn't know, what nobody knew except Margaret and Amanda, was that Thomas's secret will wasn't worth the paper it was written on, because Margaret had found something else in that office, something that changed everything. Thomas had been moving money illegally. He'd been evading taxes, hiding assets, and conducting business deals that were, to put it mildly, not entirely legal. Money laundering, tax fraud, securities violations. The list went on, and Margaret had documentation of all of it. Every transaction, every shell company, every offshore account, every dirty deal he'd ever made. At the reading of the will, Derek sat there smug as could be, waiting to hear that everything was his. He was already making plans. He'd mentioned selling the house, putting Margaret in a nice little condo somewhere. He didn't ask her opinion, of course. Why would he? She was just his mother. She was just a woman. But then Margaret's lawyer stood up. A woman, by the way. Amanda had made sure of that. There's been a challenge to the will, she said, and I'm afraid it's going to be upheld. The look on Derek's face? Honey, I wish I could have been there to see it. All that entitlement, all that certainty, just crumbling away like a sandcastle at high tide. His jaw dropped. His face went red, then white, then red again. He sputtered, unable to form words. He tried to argue, of course. He threatened, he blustered, he even tried to claim that Margaret was mentally unfit to handle financial matters. Can you imagine? This man, who had barely spoken to his mother in years, suddenly claiming to be an expert on her mental state. But Margaret was ready. She had files, documents, witnesses. She had receipts, as the young people like to say, and she had Amanda by her side, ready to fight for her mother in court if necessary. The forensic accountant had done her job well. Every hidden asset had been traced, every illegal transaction documented. In the end, Derek had a choice. He could accept a settlement, a fair portion of the legitimate assets, minus the legal fees and back taxes that would need to be paid. Or he could fight it in court and risk losing everything when the full extent of his father's crimes came to light. He could even face criminal charges as an accessory, given how involved he'd been in the family business. He took the settlement. He didn't have a choice. All right, now, where was I? Oh yes, Margaret, and her foundation. Isn't that just the most wonderful thing? Using that money to help other women who've been through the same sort of thing. I can't think of a better way to turn all that heartbreak into something positive. The Margaret Williams Foundation, that's what she called it, taking back her maiden name, has now helped over 200 women escape abusive and controlling relationships. They provide legal aid because Margaret knows firsthand how hard it is to fight for yourself when you don't have resources. They offer financial counseling to help women understand their rights and their options. They have job training programs so women can build the skills they need to support themselves. But most importantly, they provide a community of support because Margaret knows how isolating those situations can be. She knows what it's like to feel alone, to feel like no one would believe you, to feel like you have nowhere to turn. She wanted to make sure no woman ever had to feel that way again. Margaret herself works there 3 days a week, despite being well into her 70s now. She answers phones, leads support groups, and sometimes just sits with women who need someone to listen. She says it gives her purpose, and that seeing other women find their strength the way she found hers is the greatest reward she could ask for. I wasted 40 years being afraid, she told me once. I don't want anyone else to waste that time. Life is too short and too precious to spend it being small. And that villa in Tuscany? Well, I'd say she's earned herself a little slice of paradise, wouldn't you? I'm just tickled thinking about her sitting out on that patio, soaking up the sun, watching the light change over the olive groves. She's finally living life on her own terms, and goodness knows she's more than earned it. She splits her time between Italy and the States now. In Italy, she paints, something she always wanted to do but Thomas thought was a waste of time. She's taken classes, made friends with local artists, spent long afternoons in galleries and studios. Her watercolours are actually quite beautiful, landscapes mostly, full of light and colour and joy. Amanda has a few hanging in her office, and she says clients comment on them all the time. Margaret also travels now. She's been to Paris, to London, to Tokyo. She went on a safari in Kenya for her 75th birthday, saw elephants and lions and the vast African sky. She's making up for lost time, she says, making up for all those years when her world was so small. As for Derek, well, I hear he's not doing so well. Without Daddy's money to prop him up, his business ventures have all failed. He tried to start a consulting firm, but it turns out he didn't actually have any skills. He'd just been riding on his father's name and connections. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in some strip mall somewhere, living in a small apartment, driving a used car. His wife left him, took the kids. She'd had enough, apparently. I guess she'd learned something from Margaret's example after all. I don't take any pleasure in his downfall. Well, maybe just a little. But I do believe in karma, and karma, as they say, has quite the memory. Derek spent his whole life believing he was entitled to everything without earning it. He treated his mother like a servant and expected to inherit a fortune. He got exactly what he deserved. Amanda, by the way, is thriving. She made partner at her law firm last year, the youngest woman to ever hold that position. She started a pro bono program focused on helping victims of financial abuse. Inspired, she says, by what her mother went through. She visits Margaret in Italy whenever she can, and they have the relationship they always should have had, the relationship Thomas tried so hard to prevent. You know, this story really has me thinking. We all have our parts to play, don't we? Margaret, she spent so many years being what everyone else wanted her to be. The perfect wife, the doting mother, the quiet woman in the background. But then she found that steel inside her, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her around anymore. She rewrote her own story. Makes you wonder how many other Margarets are out there, just waiting for their moment to shine. How many women are right now sitting in houses that feel more like prisons, married to men who see them as possessions rather than partners? How many are afraid to speak up, afraid to leave, afraid to imagine a different kind of life? And it's not just women, of course. There are men in similar situations, people of all kinds who have been made to feel small, who have been told they don't matter, who have forgotten their own worth. Margaret's story is for all of them. Margaret's story teaches us that it's never too late. She was 62 when she finally took control of her life. 62. That's not an ending, friends. That's a beginning. It's a reminder that we are never too old to change, never too far gone to find ourselves again. The best chapters of our lives might still be unwritten. And I think there's something else we can learn from Margaret. Sometimes the people who seem the meekest, the most accommodating, the most willing to go along with whatever others want, sometimes those are the people with the deepest reserves of strength. They just haven't needed to use it yet, like a sword that's been hanging on the wall, waiting for the right moment to be drawn. Margaret learned patience in those 40 years. She learned to observe, to plan, to wait. She learned to be underestimated, and when the time came, she used every single one of those skills to reclaim her life. She turned her supposed weaknesses into her greatest strengths. Oh, and one more thing before I go. If any of you are going through something similar, please, don't hesitate to reach out. Margaret's Foundation, they're there to help. You shouldn't have to face those kinds of battles alone. No one should have to suffer in silence the way Margaret did for so many years. The website is margaretwilliamsfoundation.org, and they have a 24-hour helpline for anyone who needs it. There are resources out there. There are people who understand. There are people who believe you, who will help you, who will stand beside you when you're ready to fight for yourself. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to take the first step. I want to thank each and every one of you for staying with me through this story. I know it was a long one, but I hope you found it as inspiring as I did. Margaret's journey from silence to strength, from victim to victor. It's the kind of story that reminds us all of what's possible when we finally decide to fight for ourselves. It reminds us that our stories aren't over until we say they're over, that the people who try to hold us back, who try to keep us small, who try to write our endings for us, they don't get the final word. We do. If this story touched you, please do share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes knowing that someone else has walked a similar path and come out the other side is exactly what a person needs to take that first step. Sometimes just knowing that change is possible is enough to plant a seed. And who knows, maybe years from now, we'll be telling another story like this one. Another woman, or man, or person of any kind, who was underestimated, who was dismissed, who was told they didn't matter, and who proved everyone wrong. I hope it's your story. I hope it's the story of someone you love. I hope there are a million more Margarets out there, finding their strength, reclaiming their lives, refusing to be small anymore. All right, I think that about does it for now. You all take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. The world needs more Margarets. The world needs more people who refuse to give up on themselves. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I'll be seeing you next time.